My son said. Don't expect a dime from Dad's $92 million. At the will reading, he turned pale when he heard my name. She's still breathing. Thought she'd be gone by now. Maybe we should check her pulse while reading. That was the first thing I heard. When I came downstairs, still wearing black, still smelling faintly of the roses from my husband's funeral, they had barely tossed the last shovel of earth before the family gathered back at the estate. Not for mourning, not for memories, but for the feast and the fortune. The hallway buzzed with voices, laughter, and the soft thump of shoes marching through what used to be my sanctuary. I stood at the foot of the stairs, gripping the banister my husband once polished by hand, and watched them divide up my life, like vultures around a carcass. This one's mine. My grandson slapped a neon green sticky note onto the grandfather clock. Then the leather armchair, then the cabinet with our wedding china. He moved like a man in a showroom, claiming prizes he hadn't earned. His sister pointed her phone at the wall, an app open with blueprints and measuring lines. We'll remodel this once she's out, she said to no one in particular. Spa room, maybe. Definitely better lighting. I kept standing there. No one offered a chair. No one paused. Instead, my daughter-in-law appeared with a tray of champagne flutes. We're celebrating Dad's legacy, she said cheerfully. He built an empire, and now we get to carry it forward. And clean out the ghosts, someone muttered. Laughter erupted. My chair at the dining table was gone, replaced with a folding one. Dragged in from the garage. One leg wobbled. No cushion. They pointed me toward the mudroom instead. You'll be more comfortable there, away from the noise. I sat in silence, facing a mop bucket and a broken broom with a paper plate of dry chicken and overcooked potatoes. No one noticed. No one looked. From the other room, I could hear them. This house smells like mothballs and death, said one voice. Let's strip the wallpaper and gut the kitchen. My grandson peeled off a bright orange sticker and slapped it onto the sideboard beside me. This one's mine, he said, grinning as if he'd won a prize at the fair. His sister walked in with her phone open, using some kind of room scanning app. We'll remodel this when she's out, she said, turning slowly in place. Spa room, maybe? Or a wine-tasting nook. They didn't whisper. They didn't even glance at me. Sat very still, holding my tea with two hands so it wouldn't shake. Dad said she'd die before him. Came another. Guess that was his only mistake. She built soup. He built an empire, someone added, and the laughter grew louder. Let her rot with the memories, a cousin sneered. She doesn't even know what year it. Can we keep her pension checks if we forward her mail for a bit? My granddaughter joked. God, she's half dead already, her brother said. Let's just give her the garden shed and be done with it. I took a bite of cold chicken. It tasted like chalk. I swallowed it anyway. I didn't speak. I didn't argue. But I reached into my sweater pocket and felt the crisp edges of the document I had kept safe for years. A bank memorandum signed and notarized, dated 15 years ago. He declared me as co-founder and early investor in the family trust. My name was there, inked in blue, not black, the kind of detail that matters in court. They didn't know. They never asked. Back then, when the company was drowning and bankruptcy loomed like a shadow, it wasn't lawyers or accountants that saved it. It was me. I sold every piece of heirloom jewelry I owned. My mother's emerald necklace. My wedding bangles. Even the brooch I wore at our engagement party. I didn't tell anyone. I just wired the money and whispered to my husband, use it, but don't ever. Let them know it came from me. He didn't until now. I heard my son's voice in the next room. We'll get the lake house. The boat's already under my name anyway. The Lexus is mine. Someone else called. Dad said I could have it last Christmas. I want the Hermes scarves, the youngest said. Even if they're hers, she's not using them. more laughter. They were dividing up my skin while I was still breathing inside it. One of them walked into the mudroom, looked surprised to see me, still sitting there, and said casually, "There's bottled water in the garage fridge. Maybe grab one. You look pale." Then he left, not waiting for an answer. I stayed seated for another hour while they picked apart the art, the land, the memories. Someone even started dragging suitcases upstairs, claiming the master bedroom for the weekend. One of the girls asked if they could paint it pink. At some point, the champagne ran out and the music turned off. But the smell of greed still lingered, thicker than the dust on the drapes. I rose slowly. My knees ached. I steadied myself on the edge of the sink and looked out the small window above it. The roses my husband planted along the driveway were starting to wilt. No one had watered them in days. I wondered if anyone even noticed. I walked back into the house. Not that anyone asked where I had been. My footsteps were light like the ghosts they believed I already was. But I was not done. Not yet. I clutched the paper in my pocket, warm now from the heat of my palm. Let them drink. Let them decorate. Let them joke. The reading of the will was coming, and I had a pulse, a loud, steady, undeniable one. They look at me now like I'm a burden, a ghost, a shadow in their perfect story of success. But there's a chapter they erased because it didn't fit their version. The one where I saved everything and no one ever knew. 15 years ago, the company was crumbling. I remember the way my husband came home late, tie loosened, hands trembling, silence heavier than words. He didn't need to tell me. The bank had called. The numbers didn't lie. They were on the verge of losing everything. The clients, the contracts, even the house. "We just need one deal," he said, eyes fixed on the fireplace like he could burn the shame out of himself. "Just one. If we can close with those investors in New York, it'll turn around." But there was a problem to lock in the deal. He needed collateral. Money he didn't have, and pride he refused to put aside. So I made a choice. That night while he slept, I took out the velvet box from the back of the drawer. Inside were the last pieces of my dowry, the diamond earrings from our wedding night, the emerald ring passed down from my mother, the heavy gold bangles I wore when I first came to this house as a bride. Every memory had weight, and I sold them all quietly, without asking, without telling. I wired the funds directly to the company's escrow account the next morning and told him only one thing: use it. Don't let them see you fall. He didn't ask where the money came from. He didn't want to know. That was his way. Strong on the outside, silent on the inside. And I stayed behind the curtain. The deal closed 2 days later. The investors signed. The company lived. They called him visionary. They called him a self-made miracle. They never called me. But that wasn't the part that hurt the most. A month later, I saw the new branding materials. His face bold on the front page, a slogan underneath, "Legacy built alone." I smiled when I saw it, bit my lip, said nothing, but I remember everything. Even the night I wrote the IPO pitch by hand. He was preparing for another investor meeting and didn't know where to begin. The market was shifting. The industry was changing, and he was still pitching like it was 1995. So after everyone went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile and started to write. I outlined a multi-phase expansion strategy based on emerging trends, projected shareholder value, and a scalable growth model tied to supply chain reform. I had done it before in another life. Before marriage, before babies, before the business card that said homemaker. That night, I signed the document with a name no one would recognize. A pen name, something harmless, something clean. And the next morning, I sealed it in an envelope, stamped it, and mailed it to the office. No return address, just his name and the company's. He received it 2 days later. At dinner that night, he mentioned a strange proposal someone had sent anonymously. "It's brilliant," he said, laughing. "Even the handwriting looks familiar, like yours." I shrugged and kept stirring the soup. That proposal became the foundation of their IPO launch 6 months later. It brought in over $40 million in new investments. They hung a plaque in the lobby, inspired by ingenuity. His ingenuity. But I didn't mind. Not then. I told myself the family needed one hero, and it was better to let him be it. It's funny the way women are taught to disappear gracefully, to take pride in being the spine while someone else gets the face. We're told that quiet loyalty is noble, that sacrifice is strength. But silence too long becomes eraser. And now they walk through my house, taping their names onto furniture, speaking of legacy like I was never part of it. Now they laugh at my memory, question my mind, mock my usefulness. They don't know what I gave, what I built, what I hid. There's a folder upstairs in my closet. After he'd gone to sleep, pulled out a pad of paper, and wrote until dawn. By morning, my fingers were stained with ink. I never told him it was mine. I mailed it to our P.O. box with no return address. He presented it at the next board meeting. As his own, they approved it unanimously. It made him $38 million, and I never said a word. Mr. Alden leaned closer. "May I?" He pulled out a file from his cabinet and removed a small envelope. Inside was another letter typed, but signed L. Brightwood, the same pseudonym I'd used on the handwritten version. I watched as he compared the signature. "Do you still write like this?" he asked. I nodded. He called in a specialist that very afternoon, a handwriting analyst from Stanford. They spent 2 hours together, poring over loops and curves, pressure points and pauses. Later that week, the analyst sent a report. The letters were a match 100%, and the original work contained intellectual property clauses. Copyright and authorship belonged to me. According to federal patent law, the idea, the framework for the IPO, was considered an invention. Because it had never been formally transferred, and I could prove authorship, the royalty rights defaulted. Back to me, millions, possibly more, depending on the duration of profit. All mine. Mr. Alden looked at me across the polished wood of his desk and said, "You understand what this means?" I nodded. "I don't want the money," I said. "Not all of it. What do you want?" I folded the letter back into the folder and stood. Want my voice back? And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to smile. A small, knowing smile that began in my chest and curled its way to my lips. They buried me while I was still thinking. They assumed quiet meant useless, that love meant absence, that motherhood meant surrender. They thought I'd faded like the wallpaper, but I was simply watching and remembering. I had not forgotten who I was. I was the girl who read contracts by candlelight while her husband slept. The woman who taught herself investment law with a borrowed library card. The mother who made soup, yes, but also decisions, smart ones. Now, as they tripped over each other to carve up a house I helped build, they had no idea the land beneath their feet bore my name. And the paper trail was already with the court. By the time they sat down at the will reading, it would all be ready. But first, I would let them have their party, their games, their jokes. Let them dance around the ashes, thinking I had already blown away with the wind, because they had forgotten me, and that was their last mistake. They made me sit at the end of the table, a folding chair, of course. Because God forbid I ruin the aesthetic of their tailored wool suits and designer handbags with my old lady aura. The law office was modern, full of glass walls and leather trim, cold in every way. Outside, it was raining. Inside, it might as well have been snowing. My son Joseph sat nearest to the front, legs crossed confidently, wedding ring polished. His wife whispered something in his ear. He chuckled just loud enough for the room. "She'll be dead by next Christmas," he muttered, sipping from a complimentary espresso cup. "Don't expect a dime for her." My granddaughter was texting under the table. My grandson was practicing his signature on a legal pad. None of them looked at me. Mr. Alden walked in, briefcase in hand, and everyone straightened. He always carried the air of finality with him, a man whose voice usually meant the end of a question. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "Today, we are here to execute the final wishes of Mr. Harold Brightwood. As stated in his legally binding revised will." No one noticed the slight emphasis on the word revised. A few folders were passed out, some pages were turned, and then Mr. Alden reached into his case and removed a small silver voice recorder. He clicked it on. My husband's voice filled the room, slower than I remembered, more tired, but clear. Calm, measured. "If my son ever speaks ill of his mother," he said, "deduce $1 million per word." Silence. The breath left the room like a vacuum had been turned on. The voice continued, "You know how many he owes." There was a moment of stunned stillness, followed by the clack of a pen falling from Joseph's hand. "What the hell does that mean?" he asked, sitting forward. "That's not real." "That's not in the..." Mr. Alden held up one hand and slid forward a printed transcript. The heading read, Exhibit A, Verified Pew Transcript, Home Security System, Kitchen. 3 days after funeral. He turned the page. 1. She's still breathing. 2. Thought she'd be gone by now. 3. Check her pulse at the will reading. For she built soup. He built an empire. He kept going. 587,184 music, total recorded statements deemed ill of his mother. 88, Mr. Alden concluded that totals $88 million in deductions. However, some were rather colorful. The remaining 3,996, 2,000, were subtracted as discretionary penalty as per Clause 14C in Mr. Brightwood's addendum. He turned the final page. Remaining inheritance for Mr. Joseph Brightwood, $38,000. Joseph leaped from his seat. "This is insane. You can't do this. That woman, she's been a drain for years. Dad wouldn't." "He would," I said quietly. It was the first time I'd spoken all morning. Everyone turned. My voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Mr. Alden continued, calm as ever. "Now, as for the primary beneficiary of the trust, the copyrights and remaining estate assets, Harold Brightwood has left them to his wife, Elijah and R. Brightwood." He handed me the folder. It was heavier than I expected. Inside were the deeds, the portfolio transfers, the rights to the intellectual property tied to the IPO model. A second folder, smaller, held a deed to an apartment in Paris. And a letter, handwritten. "My husbands, forgive me for the years I let your light stay hidden. I never forgot. I only hoped someday they would see what I did. If they couldn't, then let this speak louder than I ever could. You built this with me? Now let the world know. Your name." Joseph stood frozen, face white. His wife began dialing someone, probably a lawyer, a therapist, a priest. I looked around at the room full of people who had practiced their victory speeches on the drive over, and I said nothing because justice doesn't require noise. It just needs truth. I gathered my coat. It was the same old beige one they'd called depressing last Christmas. I walked slowly past Joseph, whose hand was clenched into a fist on the polished table. As I passed the coat rack, I turned to Mr. Alden. "Will that be all?" He nodded. "Enjoy Paris." And I did, but not before turning back to the family I had. Fed, clothed, shielded, and finally outlived. "You buried me while I was still thinking," I said, steady. Too bad I had one more idea left. The silence after the will reading wasn't just awkward, it was bone deep. But I wasn't done. Mr. Alden knew that. He motioned for the second envelope. "This," he said, unfolding the packet with gloved care. Pertains to an intellectual property matter not previously disclosed to the family. He laid a series of documents before the room. 15 years ago, shortly before Brightwood Industries avoided bankruptcy through a game-changing IPO strategy, an anonymous proposal was submitted by mail. The model presented in that proposal became the blueprint for the company's public offering. He turned to page 2. This patent was formally filed under a pseudonym, Ebb Sinclair, at the time assumed to be a consultant or anonymous strategist. Joseph raised an eyebrow. What does this have to do with anything? It was Dad's company, his plan. Mr. Alden calmly flipped to the 3rd page. It has everything to do with this, Mr. Brightwood, because we recently concluded forensic analysis on the original drafts of that proposal, including ink composition, handwriting, comparison, and timing of postal submission. He slid a certificate across the table. The pseudonym was hers, he said, pointing to me. Your mother, Eleanor Brightwood, gasps. Even the air in the room seemed to hesitate. This, he continued, holding up a framed certificate, is the formal recognition of Eleanor Brightwood as sole intellectual contributor to Patent 1, 2,294,157, also known as the Brightwood Stabilization Model. The patent now yields residuals through multiple licensing streams, amounting to $9,400,000 annually. Joseph's wife clutched her scarf. Catherine, my granddaughter, dropped her phone, but Joseph stammered. She made soup. She mended socks. And Mr. Alden allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Yes, and she saved your father's legacy. He pulled a folded letter from a separate envelope, slightly aged, but still crisp. Before his passing, Mr. Brightwood left this personal note sealed. And notarized, he cleared his throat and read aloud. She found the cure. Before the world knew it was broken. She kept quiet because she loved me. I asked her to let me take the credit because the board wouldn't follow a woman. But I knew. I always knew. This company is her mind on paper. A sharp breath from the back of the room, the kind that belongs to someone, realizing everything they thought they knew, has cracked like old glass. Joseph muttered something under his breath. What was that? I asked, meeting his eyes. He looked up, finally looked at me. I didn't know, he said, voice quieter. I didn't know it was you. I didn't answer because I'd spent years erasing my name so his father could be seen as whole. I'd kept my name off the plaque. I'd burned the drafts. I'd even mailed the final model from a different zip code. But I hadn't forgotten. Mr. Alden passed the room one last page. A ledger of every quarterly payout the patent had earned since inception. All signed to a holding trust. Untouched, waiting air, he said, handing me a black folder with gold trim. It's yours now. Catherine spoke up, her voice strangely small. So, we were living off her mind all along. No one replied. They were all too busy staring at the reflections in the glass walls, wondering how they missed the most important mind in the house because it was wrapped in an apron. I stood. They didn't stop me. Not this time. I drew the map, I said quietly, buttoning my coat, and you all thought it appeared by accident. No one moved as I left. The same woman who'd once been dismissed as furniture, as fading wallpaper, had just reminded them that empires rise on the backs of women too smart to be seen and too strong to be erased. They were given 48 hours. That's what the letter said. Signed by the executive, stamped by the court. A legal deadline for the ungrateful to vanish from the house they once trampled. By morning, the packing began. Boxers thudded down the hallway. Laughter for once was gone. Catherine didn't say a word